Hello everyone, welcome to week number 3 of our stained glass flower puzzle quilt, a mystery art quilt. I hope you're enjoying yourself so far. I've started seeing pictures of your progress and I just have to say I am absolutely blown away. Each and every one of your pictures, your quilts are totally unique. And don't you just love that about quilting? We're all using the same puzzle pieces, all creating the same quilt. But absolutely none of them look the same. I've seen some of you use all different colored background pieces. I've seen some of you use all the same color fabric, the same fabric for your 5-inch squares, and I absolutely love each one of them. I've seen white flowers, I've seen yellow flowers, I've seen purple flowers, I've seen flowers that are all different colors. And I just love each and every one of them. I'll tell you, after looking at all the pictures I've started to see, I'm thinking I might make a couple more of these quilts with different colorways. So let's go ahead and get started for this week. I want to go over a few things in this video. Now, first, let me start with my color choices. These are the fabrics that I will be using for this week's puzzle pieces. We have that one, and a bright orange I think is going to really pop on my quilt. We're going to use that really crazy blue fabric that I showed in the introduction video, and a pink and 2 shades of purple. So these are my fabrics that I'll use this week to create my pieces. Aren't they pretty? And these are the puzzle pieces for week number 3. So if you would like to get your puzzle pieces, there is a link in the description box below that'll bring you straight over to the Etsy listing, and you can grab those puzzle pieces there. You might hear the heater in the background. I'm sorry about that. So many of you have asked, if you're just joining along and you've come in at video 1 or 2, or maybe this is your first video that you've caught in this series, there is an introduction video where you can find this grid in the description box of that video and print this off if you would like to have a copy of this. And it also has the fabric requirements and some of the supplies that you'll need to assemble this quilt. I'm going to put in the description box of this video a link to the playlist, and the playlist has every single video that we've done up until this point, and all the future videos of this series will be in that playlist. And so if you save the playlist in your YouTube settings, you can go straight to the playlist and see everything right in one place. So keep that in mind. But this grid is in the introduction video of this series. So we are on week 3, and I thought that by now we pretty much have the gist of creating our puzzle pieces. We've gone over 2 weeks now how to cut out our applique shapes, how to piece them on our 5-inch backgrounds, and how to adhere our backgrounds to the puzzle base. So I thought in today's video and in the future videos, we're just going to go over tips on different ways to do the process, some things that are going to help us along the way, and maybe answer questions that you have throughout the process. And so on any of the videos, feel free to jump down to the comment section and ask your questions, and I can either answer you easily by typing out the answer to your question, or it can be a topic in a future video. In last week's video, I talked about the Dritz Fray Check. And so in today's video, I'm going to show you how I use the Dritz to stop the fraying on our satin stitch and give us a nice clean look. Like this one, I did not use the Dritz, and you can see the little pieces starting to fray at the end. So I'm going to show you how you can avoid that by using the Dritz Fray Check. And I'm not sure if there's other companies that make products that do the same thing. This is the one that I've always used, and this one bottle, I've had it for about 3 years. I don't use it that often, but in this quilt I will probably get the most use out of this bottle. You can find this at places like Walmart and Joann's. Any of your fabric stores probably carry it. And I know I've seen it on Amazon. I'll put a link to that if you cannot find this, but it's fairly easy to find in retail locations. So I thought we would cover that. And then I want to have a discussion about some of the little areas that are going to be a little bit more difficult in this quilt, because in our third row we have a couple pieces that are fairly small, just like this. And so we're going to have a discussion about those pieces here in just a minute. And then at the end of the video, I want to come back once all of my squares are on my background for week number 3, and we're going to have a little bit of a chat and some ideas on how to close the gaps if you're starting to experience that your applique is not lining up to your next piece, or maybe you have a little tiny gap like this to keep everything straight, because as we're doing our satin stitch, sometimes our block might shrink a little bit, and so you might start experiencing a little gap, maybe. So I have some ideas to keep in mind, and I'm going to show you those ideas at the end of today's video. So let's go ahead. I'm going to put all this aside, and we're going to discuss these small little areas like in your piece number B3. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at these puzzle pieces. You can see A3 has fairly large applique pieces, much like the rest of the pieces we've already done to this point. When you get your puzzle pieces, you're going to take a look at B3. Now you can see this section is all white and this section is white. And then if you look really close, you're going to see that little line right underneath of the square line. That little section is a section of white. And it's so small that the polka dots did not even show up in that little tiny section. Let me show you what the section looks like when you trace it onto your freezer paper. That's how small it is. So in the design process of this quilt, I really tried to move the grid around so that I eliminated little pieces like this that fall along the edge of our squares, because we're doing a satin stitch, and look how difficult this piece possibly could be. So I'm going to give you a couple of ideas on how to stitch out this little piece. And you'll notice it again when you get down to C3, it gets really skinny right through that middle section. So some of you, depending on the width of your satin stitch that you've chosen for your quilt, might stitch into this middle section and the green will disappear there, and that's absolutely fine. So what I did is an example piece before I started with my actual B3 piece for my quilt. Let me go ahead and show you. Oh, I have two fabrics here. Let me go ahead and show you right here. This is what my block looks like with the applique pieces fused into place without the satin stitch. You can see how small that little white piece of fabric is right along the edge. Coming back, that piece is imperative to complete the flower that is in the position right above it. So our piece number B2, if you look at your quilt's progress so far, you'll notice your flower, your white piece, comes down to the bottom edge of B2. To complete the design, it comes a smidgen right into the top of B3. So that's the area that we're talking about today. And so I'm going to show you a couple of tips at the very end to where if this intimidates you, doing a satin stitch this small or losing this little white piece altogether to complete the look of the flower, then maybe some of the alternatives that I'm going to show you in just a little bit will be something that you choose to do, okay? Because it'll eliminate this piece altogether, but yet complete the look of the flower. And really that's what this does, because let me show you a picture here. I first came in with a very thin satin stitch, thinner than the rest of all of my pieces, to stitch that little white piece down, and you can see a little smidgen of white right above it. And then I came in with the regular size of a satin stitch that all of the rest of my pieces have been done, and I lost the white altogether. However, it completes the look of a little border around this white flower. So you can either choose to do the satin stitch or wait a few minutes, and I'm going to show you some alternatives that you can do to complete the look without having to stitch this little black piece right here. Actually, I guess it's a white piece, but I'm using black as my thread for my satin stitch. So I wanted to go over that, and because you're gonna, as soon as you print out your puzzle pieces and you start tracing, you're gonna notice this little piece. And I really tried to move the grid around to eliminate it. However, I was creating a lot more of these little pieces, and so this quilt design, pardon me, is really set up to reduce the amount of small pieces. There's really like 3 pieces that are small and tiny in this quilt that fall right on the edge. We have 2 more as we work down towards the bottom of the quilt that we'll have to deal with. But again, if this is too small of a piece for you to even think about stitching, then wait a few minutes, and I'm going to show you something that could save a lot of frustration when we get to the end of the quilt, or frustration trying to stitch that out. Okay, so let me go ahead and pause the video, and I'm going to show you how I use the Dritz Fray Check and show you how it really helps to keep the satin stitch from fraying as we trim off and clean up our pieces. So I wanted to share this little tip with you because in last week's video I mentioned a product called Fray Check. It's made by Dritz. I'm not quite sure if there's other companies that make it, but this one can be found at places like Walmart and Joann's, your fabric stores. You can order it online if you can't find it at any of your retail locations. But this really does the job of keeping your satin stitch from fraying away from the raw edge of your 5-inch square. See how nice and neat my stitches have stayed even after I've trimmed them away. So from the very beginning, I've recommended that you start your satin stitch off the edge of your 5-inch square and then sew into your applique all the way around. I'm going to show you how I use the Fray Check because I did not demonstrate that. But at this point, I've already done this one. We're going to come in and I'm going to add a little bit of Fray Check before I even remove the stabilizer right into my satin stitch, just like this. And it's wet and you're not going to be able to see it too well because my thread is black, but I've been pretty generous with the amount I used right into the applique and off the edge on both sides. I'm going to let that set up for about 10 minutes while I work on other things. And so after you've stitched your piece, all your satin stitches, you could go ahead and apply your Fray Check on your ends and then set this piece aside while you're stitching out the next one. After it's dry, you can come through with a pair of scissors and trim off all of the extra satin stitch from the back of your, or from the edge of your work, and you won't have to worry about your satin stitch pulling out or fraying along your edges. I'll go ahead and pause this and give this time to dry, and I'll show you how I trim it off. Okay, our Fray Check is all nice and dry now. We can go ahead and remove the stabilizer from the back side. of our block. Just like that. And now we can take our pair of scissors and come right in and trim away that raw edge. Just like that. And our satin stitch no longer frays or starts to fall apart right on the raw edge of our block. Go ahead and do this one together as well. Just tearing off that stabilizer. Just like that. And now we can come in and clean up our edges. Just like that. Like that. Like that. And just like that. Oh, we got one more. And just like that. So now we have really clean edges that aren't going to fray at the edge of our block. You could see what happens if you don't use the fray check. More than likely you're going to have some strings that start to come unraveled right at the edge once you clip off and clean up your block. So I'm hoping that that tip saves you a little bit of frustration. Again, this was just the Dritz Fray Check. And one bottle, I've had this bottle for about 3 years. This quilt is probably the most I've used this Fray Check in a long time, but it certainly does the job, and it works out pretty well. And as we finish up for today, that was the Dritz Fray Check. Again, you can find that at a lot of retail locations carry it. It's pretty easy to find. There will be an Amazon link down below if you cannot find this anywhere. So you can see that it really does help keep your stitches from fraying, and it's very easy to use. You just have to allow for a little bit of drying time. So you can see I've already stitched my pieces and they are glued to my fabric base. It's not going to all fit into the picture, but you can get an idea of what my quilt looks like so far. So just like that. And we're going to have a little bit of a discussion, but let me show you a picture of the whole quilt so far, my rows 1, 2, and 3 right here. And you can see what my quilt is shaping up to look like. And I absolutely love it. So let's have a little bit of a discussion, because as we're working through, if you're like me and you like everything exact and perfect and no willy-nilly things going on, then at this point, by week 3, you might start getting a little frustrated, because as we cut our applique pieces, we might lose a little bit of size, depending on our tracing, what we're tracing our pieces with. Sometimes if we use like a mechanical pencil, we get a smaller line, which helps us stay more accurate. If you're using a marker like I am, then the line is wider, and I might be cutting my applique shape too small. So I'm having some issues with my pieces lining up, and the fabric marker works great in blending those areas in, and I'm happy with that. And I think, you know, overall, especially when you step back and look at the quilt, it looks gorgeous. Some of you might not really be really happy with that, and so I'm going to show you a couple of alternatives that you can start to think about as we work on weeks 4 through weeks 8 and come to finish this quilt. In, I believe it was week 1, I mentioned and showed an example of how we could do a zigzag stitch once this quilt is complete and layered with our batting to finish off these edges along our 5-inch squares and quilt our quilt at the same time. I think that would help blend in a lot of our gaps from where maybe our squares are shrinking from the density of the satin stitch. Also, to help you with the shrinking issue, because I did have someone say that she thought that her squares were shrinking because of the satin stitch. Maybe if you double a couple layers of stabilizer underneath, that really helps your fabric from pulling in and shrinking some. Also, if you start your 5-inch piece before you begin, that also helps eliminate some of the shrinking. And if you maybe lower the tension on your top thread, that also helps keep the fabric from pulling into your satin stitch. So there's 3 different things to consider if you've noticed your 5-inch squares really shrinking after a satin stitch. Check those 3 things and maybe change up a little bit and see if you don't notice less shrinking. My issue is a little bit of shrinking, but also I'm probably not very accurate in tracing my pieces. I have shaky hands, and when cutting I probably lose a little bit of my applique size. So I've thought, what about, instead of doing a zigzag stitch through here, we do some other things. You know, this is an art quilt, it's a stained glass quilt, so how about this as an alternative? This is a ball of black yarn. It's a little bit thicker, and I've taken the label away a long time ago, so I could not tell you which brand this is or how thick it is because that label has been long gone. But you know, you could always go down the aisle at Walmart or Joann's or Michael's and look at all the different pretty yarns if you chose to do something like this. And we could zigzag stitch the black yarn or couch it onto our quilt as we're quilting everything, and look how pretty it covers that seam just like that, and it hides a lot of the pieces that don't exactly match up. So imagine how pretty that would be as a border around all of our pieces, and it would look, you know, have the look of stained glass. So this could be an alternative. It would also help cover the small pieces if you did not want to do the little satin stitch like we discussed at the beginning on your piece number B3. It would completely cover that piece, and you would not have to do the satin stitch on that little small applique piece. So if that's something that intimidates you, or you're thinking that it's going to mess up the look of your quilt, don't even mess with doing the little applique piece on B3, and think more about doing something like this at the end with some yarn. Another good alternative would be some binding strips. You know, they have all those bias tape makers that you can get, or you can make your own by sewing a strip like this in half and then pressing the seam on the back. So you could make all different widths of bias tape. So this is just raw edge strips of fabric that have not been folded over or anything like that, and you could make bias tape just like this. And that's what I did. I just folded this in half and did a stitch all the way down. When I pressed it, I flattened everything out and put the seam on the back, and that is how I created this bias tape. Finished edges on both sides. This is a little bit wider, and look at that. See how pretty that would be to finish off your quilt? And so these things I did not mention in the very beginning of the introduction video, because they're really alternatives. And at this point, if these little issues, like this little gap right here, that's my that's my doing. It's not because the pieces shouldn't fit. It's because, you know, I did not cut my applique all the way to the line, and now I see a little gap. But watch this. Just like that, it completely covers that gap, and it finishes off the quilt very nice. And so the way you could apply this is very simple. You could glue stick it, or with wet glue, put it on there, dry it with your iron, or just let it air dry over time, and then come back with some black thread in your machine and just do a zigzag stitch and secure that in place, and you'll quilt your quilt at the same time. So maybe that's an alternative that you want to think about. Just like that. Look how pretty that finishes everything off and gives a nice crisp finish, and you won't see any raw edges of your 5-inch squares. You can make your bias tape all different kinds of widths, and so there's a thick one, just like that, and here's a thinner one. So depending on the look that you're going for, of course it's not going to lay flat, but you can see you get two totally different looks, but yet it finishes off the quilt perfect, and it hides any places that you might not want to tackle with the small little smidgens of applique. So these are all things to keep in mind as we approach the middle of our quilt. Next week will be week 4, and just give you some ideas to think about. I am not bothered by a lot of this, and I think, you know, because my eye is drawn to it, and certainly I'm not fixing any of these issues, because I want you to see the possibilities of what could happen as you're making your quilt. So I'm going to keep all of these issues. Remember, we had the little issue right here with this gap because I did not cut this piece right. I'm keeping them in, and I'm pointing them out to you so that you can see these are things that you might have to deal with. But in your quilt, one thing I always tell everyone, most of the people we know, and we're going to show our quilts to, are not quilters. And if you show them the quilt, they're never going to see your mistakes unless you say, oh yeah, right here I goofed up a little bit and right here was a small little gap. They're never going to notice that. Even if you don't do any bias tape or any yarn and you choose to do the zigzag stitch, when you look at your finished quilt, it's going to be gorgeous. You know, this is an art quilt. This is not a quilt that we're going to use on our bed, and we can do all different kinds of things to it. And art is subjective to the creator and to the person who sees it. And, you know, this does not bother me in the whole big scheme of things. I do think that I will cover that up just like that though, and see what that looks like as we approach the ending of our quilt. So just some things to keep in mind. I've had a lot of fun creating week number 3 and spending some time with you. Again, I would love if you continue to share your progress in your pictures. If you don't do Facebook, send me a picture through Etsy. You know, my shop is down below. Just click there and send me a message and show me your picture. I'd love to see it. And I've thought about, after week 4, when we're halfway through, if you would love to include your picture in week 5 week number 5's video, then maybe we can do a slideshow so that everyone can see the progress of your quilt and really be inspired, because they are all so lovely and so different. And so I think that would be a lot of fun to do a little slideshow after week 4. So I hope you have a fantastic week. Again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate. Drop down below, and if it's something I can answer easily, I'll answer you there. And if it's something that you know, is not so easy to explain by typing out, then I'll include it in a separate video or in next week's video. So until we meet again next week, I hope you all have a very wonderful and blessed week, and we'll see you really soon. Bye, everyone.